From the time of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to Jesus and the apostles, God's people have always kept the seventh day of each week as holy time for rest and worship. If you search the New Testament, you won't find a single passage that tells Christians to observe the first day of the week. Yet today, millions of people go to church each week on Sunday. If you ask a priest or pastor how this change occurred, you will probably get a vague or incoherent answer. But some of the more studied clergy will give you one of four possible answers. In this video, we will examine these arguments and present clear, biblical reasons why Christians shouldn't observe Sunday. The first argument is that Jesus abolished the law of Moses. Mainstream churches claim that Jesus replaced the Mosaic Law with a new set of laws that doesn't include the Sabbath. But Jesus explicitly said that he didn't abolish the law of Moses and that he expected his followers to keep God's commandments. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Throughout the New Testament, the apostles taught Jewish and Gentile Christians to keep God's law. For example, in Romans chapter 3, verse 31, Paul clearly said that the new covenant doesn't abolish the Torah. Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. God gave the Mosaic Law as a basic definition of right and wrong for all humanity, and he established the seventh-day Sabbath at creation as a blessing for Adam and Eve and all their children. Jesus confirmed this fact in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, where he said, "The Sabbath was made for man." In this passage, Mark used the Greek term anthropos, which refers to all of humanity in general, not just the Israelites. And the epistle to the Hebrews specifically says that the Sabbath is still relevant for Christians. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 8 says, "For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience." The Sabbath is a prophetic symbol. By resting on the seventh day, just as God rested at creation, Christians foreshadow the coming of the millennial rest that God's people will enjoy when Jesus Christ returns. Early Christians also continued to keep the biblical feasts with a deeper understanding of the Messianic symbolism contained in these celebrations. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, Paul told Jewish and Gentile Christians to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. "Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." The second argument is that Sunday worship began as an apostolic tradition. Mainstream churches readily admit that the New Testament doesn't contain a command to rest and worship on Sunday. Instead, They claim that Sunday worship began as an apostolic tradition. However, there is no biblical or historical support for this claim. There are only 7 passages in the New Testament that mention the first day of the week, and most of them are related to the resurrection of Jesus. Matthew chapter 28, verse 1, Mark chapter 16, verse 2, Luke chapter 24, verse 1, and John chapter 20, verse 1, all say that some women went to Jesus' tomb just before sunrise on the first day of the week and found it empty. John chapter 20, verse 19 says, "On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.'" None of these passages say that the first day of the week is now a holy day, or that the disciples were holding a Christian church service. In fact, Matthew chapter 28, verse 1 specifically called the 7th day of the week the Sabbath, showing that nothing had changed. In Acts chapter 20, Luke says that Paul and a group of Christians sailed from Philippi to Troas during their journey to Jerusalem and spent a week there. Acts chapter 20, verse 7 says, "On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight." Many commentators claim that this was a communion service, but the phrase Lord's Supper doesn't appear anywhere in this passage, and the phrase breaking bread was a common expression for eating a meal. For example, in Acts chapter 2, verse 46, Luke says that the early Christians in Jerusalem were, day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart. This is also confirmed by Acts chapter 20, verse 11, which says, "And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while, until daybreak, and so departed." Luke also said that they gathered on the first day of the week, using the Greek expression en te mia ton sabbaton, which is a uniquely Jewish way of expressing time that is consistent with the gospel accounts that we've already covered. Based on Luke's description, Paul and his traveling companions kept the Sabbath with the Christians at Troas, and after sunset they assembled to observe the ancient custom of Havdalah prior to preparing and eating their evening meal together. Havdalah is a Hebrew term meaning division or separation. It refers to a traditional verbal declaration made at the end of the Sabbath, which separated the holy day from the secular time that follows. According to the Talmud, in Berachot 33a, the men of the great synagogue instituted blessings and prayers, sanctifications, and havdalot for Israel in the 4th century BC. The Sabbath ends at sunset, so Havdalah may only be said once darkness has fallen on Saturday night, which marks the beginning of the first day of the week. Acts chapter 20, verse 7 doesn't contain any evidence that the first day of the week is now a holy day or that Christians were holding a regular Sunday church service. The last New Testament passage that mentions the first day of the week is 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 3, where Paul gave instructions about a special offering for the poor. Now about the collection for the Lord's people, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Then, When I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. Modern commentators see this as an example of passing a collection plate around at a Sunday morning church service, based on their own personal experience. But once again, there is no evidence here that the first day of the week is now a holy day, or that Christians were holding a regular Sunday church service. There is a better explanation of this passage that is consistent with the history and culture of the early New Testament church. After the Jewish people returned from the Babylonian exile, they were very careful to avoid buying or selling on the Sabbath. They developed an aversion to handling money on the Sabbath. So it was completely normal for Paul to tell his Sabbath-keeping congregations to wait until after Havdalah to collect their weekly offering, tally the amount, and then deposit the money with a banker or some other secure facility. That way, there would be no collections when Paul arrived. Modern commentators also claim that the Apostle John mentioned the tradition of Sunday worship based on their interpretation of Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, which says, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet." However, this is the only place in the New Testament where the Greek phrase en te kuriake hemera occurs, and John didn't explain what it meant. So, scholars have proposed 4 possible meanings for this passage. John had a prophetic vision on Sunday, or John had a prophetic vision on Easter Sunday, or John had a prophetic vision on the Sabbath day, and finally, John had a prophetic vision about the day of the Lord, in other words, the second coming of Jesus Christ. The simple fact that scholars can't agree on the interpretation of Revelation chapter 1 verse 10 means that once again there is no solid evidence here that the first day of the week is now a holy day or that Christians were holding a regular Sunday church service. But the case for Sunday worship is far weaker than biased theologians would have you believe. Scholars claim that the Lord's Day must refer to Sunday worship based on 3 very doubtful passages from the 2nd century that include the Epistle of Ignatius to the Magnesians, chapter 9, verse 1, Didache, chapter 14, verse 1, and the Gospel of Peter, paragraph 9, verse 35, and paragraph 12, verse 50. However, there are serious problems with all 3 of these documents. First of all, the epistles of Ignatius are completely untrustworthy. There are 3 different versions of the epistles of Ignatius that disagree with each other. The long recension contains 13 letters in Greek and Latin that consist of 7 highly edited or expanded letters and 6 outright forgeries written around the 4th century. The middle recension contains 7 letters in Greek, Latin, Coptic, Syriac, and Armenian that are generally accepted as authentic 2nd century documents. And the short recension contains abbreviated versions of 3 letters written in Syriac. Scholars first believed that the long recension was authentic, but over time support shifted to the middle recension. When the short recension came to light, some scholars said that they were the genuine letters, while other scholars still believe that none of these are the original unedited epistles of Ignatius. In the 2nd century, many heretical gospels and fraudulent letters appeared, and we know for certain that several of these epistles are highly edited or totally fake, which casts doubt on all of these alleged epistles. The oldest Greek manuscript dates to the 11th century, and the oldest patristic quotations come from Theodoret in the 5th century and Eusebius in the 4th. So there is no proof that any of these epistles are genuine. Scholars have also known for centuries that the theology of these letters sounds more like the 3rd century than the 1st, which is highly suspicious, and there are internal contradictions that undermine their credibility. Now that we've covered the background of the epistles, let's see what Magnesians 9 says about the Lord's Day. The short recension doesn't include this epistle, and the middle recension says, "If therefore those who were brought up in the ancient order of things have come to the possession of a new hope, no longer observing the Sabbath, but living in the observance of the Lord's Day, on which also our life has sprung up again by him and by his death, whom some deny, by which mystery we have obtained faith, and therefore endure, that we may be found the disciples of Jesus Christ, our only Master. How shall we be able to live apart from him, whose disciples the prophets themselves in the Spirit did wait for him as their teacher? And therefore he whom they rightly waited for, being come, raised them from the dead." This passage makes 3 key claims. First, that Jewish believers have stopped keeping the Sabbath. Second, that they now live according to the Lord's Day. And third, that Jesus raised the Old Testament prophets back to life during his earthly ministry. The first problem with this passage is that it flatly contradicts what Jesus taught about the Torah in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. But this antinomian sentiment is consistent with heretical forgeries from the 2nd century. The second problem is that there is a significant textual variant in this passage. The oldest Greek text says, "Me keti sabbatidzantes ala kata kuriakein zoein zontes," which means no longer sabbatizing, but living according to the Lord's life. The word day is absent in this passage. However, it could also be translated as living a life according to the Lord's day, if zoein is part of a cognate accusative construction and the term day is implied. Most scholars, since Theodore Zahn and J.B. Lightfoot, have followed the Latin text which says, living according to the Lord's day, but this variant is still problematic. The third problem is the claim that Jesus raised the Old Testament prophets back to life during his earthly ministry. This unbiblical teaching appears to be a misunderstanding of a story about the crucifixion of Jesus found in Matthew chapter 27, verses 51 through 54. "And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, 'Truly, this was the Son of God.'" Evidently, God resurrected several other people when Jesus rose from the dead. Matthew doesn't say who these people were or how long they had been dead, but we can be sure that this didn't include all of the Old Testament prophets. Shortly after Jesus ascended to heaven, Peter told the people of Jerusalem about the resurrection. In Acts chapter 2, verse 29, Peter said, "Brothers, I may say to you with confidence, about the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Being therefore a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants on his throne, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. If God had resurrected the prophets of the Old Testament, he certainly would have raised David, and the apostles certainly would have mentioned that in the Gospels. We don't know who wrote Magnesians chapter 9, but whoever it was, he didn't know his Bible very well and was guilty of spreading fanciful and unbiblical stories, just like the other heretics of the mid-2nd century. Now, let's compare this text with Magnesians chapter 9 from the long recension. Remember, scholars claim that the middle recension comes from the early 2nd century, and that the long recension is a 4th century embellishment of the original text. Pay careful attention and see if you can spot parts of the middle recension in this passage. If, then, those who were conversant with the ancient scriptures came to newness of hope, expecting the coming of Christ, as the Lord teaches us when he says, "If you had believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me." And again, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. But before Abraham was, I am." How shall we be able to live without him? The prophets were his servants and foresaw him by the Spirit, and waited for him as their teacher, and expected him as their Lord and Savior, saying, "He will come and save us." Let us therefore no longer keep the Sabbath after the Jewish manner, and rejoice in days of idleness. For he that does not work, let him not eat. For, say the holy oracles, "In the sweat of thy face thou shalt eat thy bread." But let every one of you keep the Sabbath after a spiritual manner, rejoicing in meditation on the law, not in relaxation of the body, admiring the workmanship of God, and not eating things prepared the day before, nor using lukewarm drinks, and walking within a prescribed space, nor finding delight in dancing and plaudits, which have no sense in them. And after the observance of the Sabbath, let every friend of Christ keep the Lord's Day as a festival. The resurrection day, the queen and chief of all the days of the week. Looking forward to this, the prophet declared, "To the end, for the 8th day, on which our life both sprang up again, and the victory over death was obtained in Christ, whom the children of perdition, the enemies of the Savior, deny, whose God is their belly, who mind earthly things, who are lovers of pleasure and not lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. These make merchandise of Christ, corrupting his word, and giving up Jesus to sale. They are corrupters of women, and covetous of other men's possessions, swallowing up wealth insatiably, from whom may ye be delivered by the mercy of God through our Lord Jesus Christ." The first problem is that this supposedly later passage doesn't tell us to abandon the Sabbath. It contradicts the middle recension and exhorts Christians to keep the Sabbath, not according to the Pharisaic rules of the Jews, but in a spiritual manner, which is consistent with the teaching of Jesus and the apostles throughout the New Testament. The second problem is the claim that the Old Testament predicted the Lord's Day based on a misquote of the title for Psalms 6 and 7 in the Septuagint, which reads, "Eis ta telos, huper tes agdaes." The actual title is, "For the director of music with stringed instruments, according to Sheminith," which probably refers to an 8-stringed lyre. Once again, we don't know who wrote this, but whoever he was, he didn't know his Bible very well and was guilty of spreading fanciful and unbiblical stories. When we compare the claims of the middle recension and long recension side by side, we can see several glaring problems. The middle recension claims that Sabbath keeping is over and that Christians now only keep Sunday, although there is a pesky textual variant that casts doubt over the original wording of the passage. It also includes false teaching about Jesus raising the Old Testament prophets back to life. On the other hand, the long recension encouraged Christians to keep the Sabbath and the Lord's Day. It also includes false teaching that the Old Testament predicted the establishment of Sunday worship. Most scholars today claim that the middle recension is the authentic 2nd century text and that the long recension is the 4th century embellishment. They are asking us to believe that 1st century Christians stopped keeping the Sabbath, but then went back to Sabbath keeping in the 4th century. That is insane. It is much more likely that both texts are forgeries that may have been based on an earlier common text. We consider all the epistles of Ignatius to be untrustworthy and wouldn't date any of them earlier than 140 AD. Magnesians 9 doesn't provide any credible evidence that John was discussing the first day of the week in Revelation chapter 1 verse 10, or that Christians were holding a regular Sunday church service during the 1st century. The Didache is an ancient document of uncertain authorship, date, and location. Some scholars believe that it was originally a Jewish discourse called the Two Ways, that Christians later augmented and edited. There are similarities with the Talmud and other Jewish sources. The Didache and Pseudo-Barnabas overlap in several places, but it is impossible to determine which came first. Lightfoot believed that they both quoted from an earlier common source. Harnack and other scholars believed that it probably went through a series of recensions. Clement of Alexandria is the first person to quote from the Didache around 170 AD, so it probably reached its final form in the mid-2nd century. Scholars cite Didache chapter 14 verse 1 as evidence that the Lord's Day refers to regular Sunday worship in Revelation chapter 1 verse 10. But there are several problems with this argument. Didache 14 verse 1 says, "And on the Lord's own day, gather yourselves together and break bread and give thanks, first confessing your transgressions, that your sacrifice may be pure." Once again, the term day is missing in the original Greek of this passage and has been supplied by the translator. While nouns and pronouns are sometimes implied in Koine Greek, the phrase kata kuriakein de kuriou is still awkward and possibly corrupt. The second problem is that Didache 14 verse 1 does not identify the Lord's Day as Sunday. In fact, the Didache doesn't even mention the first day of the week or the resurrection of the Lord. However, Didache chapter 8 verse 1 does call Friday the preparation day, which implies that these Christians were keeping the Sabbath. There is no reason why the Lord's Day couldn't refer to the Sabbath. For centuries, the Jewish people have recited the Hamotzi blessing over challah bread and the Kiddush blessing over the wine at the beginning of the Sabbath. This is consistent with the early Christian practice of holding an agape feast in the evening rather than the morning. This may explain why Didache chapter 8 verse 1 encouraged people to fast on Friday since they would break their fast with a Eucharistic celebration on the Sabbath, as described in Didache chapter 9. There is also no reason why the Lord's Day couldn't refer to the annual observance of the Christian Passover. We will come back to this point when we finish discussing the possible interpretations of Revelation chapter 1, verse 10. So once again, we see that Didache chapter 14, verse 1 doesn't provide credible evidence that John was discussing the first day of the week in Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, or that Christians were holding a regular Sunday church service during the first century. In fact, Didache chapter 14, verse 1 seems to indicate that Christians were keeping the Sabbath or the Passover with a new Christian understanding that is consistent with the testimony of both the New Testament and early church history. The last passage that mainstream churches cite as proof that the Lord's Day refers to regular Sunday worship is the Gospel of Peter, paragraph 9, verse 35, and paragraph 12, verse 50. But once again, there are serious problems with this evidence. First, the Gospel of Peter is completely untrustworthy. The church of Rhosis near Antioch was using this document at the end of the 2nd century when a controversy arose concerning its contents. Serapion, the bishop of Antioch, examined it and condemned it as a docetic forgery, and Eusebius listed it among the forged heretical gospels of his day. It disappeared from history until 1886, when archaeologists in Upper Egypt discovered a parchment with portions of 3 heretical works, including the Gospel of Peter. The first half of the text is missing, and the narrative begins with Pilate washing his hands just before the crucifixion of Jesus. The Gospel of Peter contains numerous historical inaccuracies, and scholars universally agree that it is a forgery from the mid-2nd century. The fact that many mainstream churches resort to quoting the Gospel of Peter as evidence for their Sunday doctrine shows just how weak and pathetic their position is. The second problem is that the Gospel of Peter offers no proof that the first day of the week is now a holy day or that Christians were holding a regular Sunday church service. Gospel of Peter, paragraph 9, verse 35 says, "And in the night in which the Lord's day was drawing on, as the soldiers kept guard 2 by 2 in a watch, there was a great voice in the heaven." Paragraph 12, verse 50 says, "And at dawn upon the Lord's day, Mary Magdalene, a disciple of the Lord, fearing because of the Jews, since they were burning with wrath, had not done at the Lord's sepulchre the things which women are wont to do for those that die and for those that are beloved by them." In both passages, the term day is missing from the original Greek and has been supplied by the translator. This supports the notion that by the 2nd or 3rd century, the phrase "the Lord's day" had been shortened and that the missing noun was simply implied. At best, these passages associate the Lord's Day with the resurrection of Jesus. There is no discussion of Christians holding a weekly celebration of this event. As we have seen, there are serious problems with Magnesians, the Didache, and the Gospel of Peter. But the biggest problem of all is that it isn't appropriate to use 2nd century literary sources to define a 1st century phrase. Words get hijacked all the time, and the Sabbath Sunday controversy would have tempted people to repurpose John's words for nefarious theological motives. For example, many churches redefine the Sabbath to mean Sunday and redefine Passover to mean Easter, so the same thing could have happened here with the Lord's Day. It is also highly unlikely that John referred to Easter Sunday as the Lord's Day. According to church history, John taught the churches of Asia Minor to keep the Christian Passover on the 14th day of the Hebrew month Aviv rather than Easter Sunday. In the 2nd century, during the Quartodeciman controversy, the bishops of Rome criticized the churches of Asia Minor because they refused to observe Easter Sunday, while the Asian bishops Polycarp and Polycrates defended the apostolic custom of John. There is a possibility that John was referring to the Sabbath as the Lord's Day. Although this would be an unusual way to describe the Sabbath, some scholars believe that John was contrasting the worship of Caesar on Emperor's Day with the worship of the Lord on his Sabbath. Although this is an interesting theory, there isn't much evidence in favor of this interpretation. Based on the content of the book of Revelation, it is far more likely that John was referring to the Day of the Lord, which is a very well-attested Old Testament theme connected with the second coming of Jesus Christ and the establishment of God's kingdom. Whatever John may have meant by the phrase, the Lord's Day, there is simply no proof in Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, that the first day of the week is now a holy day, or that Christians were holding a regular Sunday church service. Instead, the New Testament shows that early Christians continued to keep the weekly Sabbath and biblical holy days with a deeper understanding of their messianic and prophetic symbolism. The third argument is that the church transferred the Sabbath to Sunday. Over the centuries, Roman Catholics, English Puritans, and Scottish Presbyterians taught that the post-apostolic church sanctified and legislated Sunday worship based on its own authority, and church history does provide some evidence on this particular point. The New Testament shows that the early church was exclusively Jewish and that they continued to observe the Sabbath and biblical feasts. Prior to 64 AD, the Romans largely ignored the fledgling Christian faith and considered it to be just another Jewish sect that was entitled to the same historic legal protections granted to Judaism. Most of the early persecution of the church came from the Jewish authorities. By the time of the first Jewish revolt in 70 AD, the church was largely composed of Gentile converts from paganism. By 90 AD, the Jewish authorities had expelled the remaining Jewish Christians from the synagogues, and the Romans began to persecute Christians because they would not worship the divinity of Caesar. This combined persecution from both Roman and Jewish authorities further isolated Christians from society. The Bar Kokhba rebellion broke out in 132 AD, which resulted in widespread anti-Jewish sentiment in the empire. The Romans crushed this rebellion by 135 AD, but both sides suffered heavy losses. To prevent further trouble, Emperor Hadrian issued harsh proclamations designed to stamp out the Jews and Judaism. About this time, the church at Rome appears to have abandoned the Christian Passover and the Sabbath in favor of Easter and weekly Sunday worship. After a thorough review of patristic literature from this period, biblical scholar Samuel Bacchiocchi concluded that the repressive measures adopted by the Romans against the Jews, particularly felt in the capital city, apparently encouraged the predominant Gentile membership of the Church of Rome to clarify to the Roman authorities their distinction from Judaism by changing the date and manner of observance of characteristic Jewish festivals, such as the Passover and the Sabbath, which most Christians still observed. We found, in fact, that the Church of Rome took a definitive stand against both festivities. In the mid-2nd century, several anti-Jewish works appeared that promoted Sunday worship over the Sabbath, such as Pseudo-Barnabas, Pseudo-Ignatius, and the writings of Justin Martyr. The popularity of Roman sun worship on the first day of the week made it easy to conflate Jesus Christ with Sol Invictus, the Roman sun god. Thus, the long process of blending apostate Christianity with pagan worship had begun. Eventually, the apostate church added more restrictions to Sunday. By 200 AD, Tertullian forbade kneeling, fasting, or personal business on Sunday. The rise of Emperor Constantine had a profound impact on both the Roman Empire and Christianity. In 312 AD, he defeated his rival, Maxentius, at the Battle of Milvian Bridge to become the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. He attributed his victory to a miraculous sign from heaven, and in 313 AD, he issued the Edict of Toleration, which ended Roman persecution of Christianity. According to Schaff's History of the Christian Church, Constantine adopted Christianity first as a superstition and put it by the side of his heathen superstition, till, finally, in his conviction, the Christian vanquished the pagan, though without itself developing into a pure and enlightened faith. At first, Constantine, like his father, in the spirit of the Neoplatonic syncretism of dying heathendom, reverenced all the gods as mysterious powers, especially Apollo, the god of the sun. His coins bore on the one side the letters of the name of Christ, and on the other the figure of the sun god, and the inscription Sol Invictus. During this period, the nature of Sunday worship continued to change. Philip Schaff explains what happened next. The ancient church viewed the Sunday mainly, we may say, one-sidedly, and exclusively from its Christian aspect as a new institution, and not in any way as a continuation of the Jewish Sabbath. It observed it as the day of the commemoration of the resurrection, or of the new spiritual creation, and hence as a day of sacred joy and thanksgiving, standing in bold contrast to the days of humiliation and fasting, as the Easter festival contrasts with Good Friday. So long as Christianity was not recognized and protected by the state, the observance of Sunday was purely religious, a strictly voluntary service, but exposed to continual interruption from the bustle of the world and a hostile community. The pagan Romans paid no more regard to the Christian Sunday than to the Jewish Sabbath. In this matter, as in others, the ascension of Constantine marks the beginning of a new era and did good service to the church and to the cause of public order and morality. Constantine is the founder, in part at least, of the civil observance of Sunday, by which alone the religious observance of it in the church could be made universal and could be properly secured. In the year 321, he issued a law prohibiting manual labor in the cities and all judicial transactions, and a later period also military exercises on Sunday. For the army, however, he went beyond the limits of negative and protective legislation, to which the state ought to confine itself in matters of religion, and enjoined a certain positive observance of Sunday in requiring the Christian soldiers to attend Christian worship. In 325 AD, the apostate church took the next logical step in undermining God's Sabbaths. The First Council of Nicaea officially replaced the Christian Passover with Easter Sunday. By 364 AD, the Council of Laodicea condemned Sabbath keeping and actively promoted Sunday as the new Christian Sabbath. Canon 29 of the Council of Laodicea says, "Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day, rather honoring the Lord's day, and, if they can, resting then as Christians. But if any shall be found to be Judaizers, let them be anathema from Christ." By 500 A.D., Caesarius of Arles claimed the Sabbath had been transferred to Sunday. In the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas also proclaimed, "In the new law, the observance of the Lord's day took the place of the observance of the Sabbath, not by virtue of the precept, but by the institution of the Church and the custom of Christian people." In the centuries that followed, English Puritans and Scottish Presbyterians also followed suit in proclaiming Sunday as the new Christian Sabbath. 20th century Catholic theologian Vincent Kelly made the following candid admission. "Some theologians have held that God likewise directly determined the Sunday as the day of worship in the new law, that he himself has explicitly substituted the Sunday for the Sabbath. But this theory is now entirely abandoned. It is now commonly held that God simply gave his church the power to set aside whatever day or days she should deem suitable as holy days. The church chose Sunday, the first day of the week, and, in the course of time, added other days as holy days." The problem with this theory is that the church can't transfer the Sabbath to Sunday. God is sovereign over everything, so he alone can determine what is and isn't holy. James chapter 4, verse 12 says, "There is only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and to destroy." God specifically sanctified the seventh day at creation, and he has never annulled or modified that command. Genesis chapter 2, verse 3 says, "So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation." God told his people not to change his laws and never allowed anyone to change his Sabbaths. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 32 says, "Everything that I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to it or take from it." Mainstream Christians are guilty of breaking God's law and creating a counterfeit, man-made Sabbath. As a result, they are cut off from God and worshiping him in vain. Hosea chapter 4, verse 6 says, "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children." In Mark chapter 7, verse 7, Jesus said, "In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men." The fourth argument is that Sunday is a voluntary day of worship. Many mainstream churches reject the idea that the Pope or the Church transferred the Sabbath to Sunday. They maintain the earlier view that Christians are free to worship on any day of the week, so there is nothing wrong with gathering for worship on Sunday. The problem with this argument is that Christians aren't free to worship with apostates. Mainstream churches are defiled with paganism, idolatry, blasphemy, uncleanness, immorality, and false doctrines, such as antinomianism and Sabbath breaking. The Bible clearly commands God's people not to fellowship with such heretical groups. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14 says, "Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? Romans chapter 16, verse 17 says, "And now I make one more appeal, my dear brothers and sisters, watch out for people who cause divisions and upset people's faith by teaching things contrary to what you have been taught. Stay away from them." And 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 6 says, "Now we command you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you keep away from any brother who is walking in idleness and not according to the tradition that you received from us." God commands his people to rest and gather for worship on the Sabbath and biblical feast days. Christians can also meet at other times for Bible studies, prayer meetings, or worship concerts. But not everyone who claims to be a Christian actually obeys God. We have seen that God did not abolish the Sabbath or sanctify Sunday as a regular day of rest and worship. Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, and Pentecostal churches are guilty of breaking God's Sabbath and creating a counterfeit Sabbath to replace it. Mainstream Christians are following a false gospel mixed with paganism that does not save. They are obeying the commandments of men and worshiping God in vain. They are cut off from God and not part of the body of Christ. God is calling you out of this web of lies, and this is his message to you right now. "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live." Once God reveals the truth to a person, he holds that person accountable for what they know. God is watching to see what you will do next. What will it be?